Have you ever felt the exact moment your life began to fall apart, before anyone else could see it? I didn't realize that was what it was at first. I told myself it was just a bad day. Just bad timing. Just a misunderstanding I could fix if I stayed calm long enough. But looking back now, I can still see it clearly, the way the air felt heavier. The way people looked at me like I didn't belong where I was standing. I was barefoot, standing in the middle of a crowded bus station. My suitcase gone. My phone nearly dead. And one hand wrapped protectively around my stomach. I was 7 months pregnant, exhausted, and trying not to cry in front of strangers who kept walking past me like I was invisible. And then my sister saw me. Her face went completely pale. Not confused. Not surprised. Terrified. She froze for a second like she couldn't believe what she was looking at. Then she rushed toward me. Her voice sharp, urgent, almost breaking as she grabbed my arms. "What happened to you?" I opened my mouth. But nothing came out. Because I didn't know where to begin. Because the truth didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly, carefully, like something designed to break me piece by piece. And I didn't even realize I was falling until I had already lost everything. A few hours earlier, I had still believed I was going home. I remember sitting in the car, staring out the window as the city blurred past me. The sky was gray, heavy with clouds, but I barely noticed. My mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying the same questions over and over again. When did things start changing? When did he start looking at me like I was a problem instead of his wife? Jonathan hadn't always been like this. There was a time when he used to hold my hand in public, when he would check on me constantly after we found out I was pregnant, when he would talk about our future like it was something we were building together. But lately, something had shifted. At first, it was small. Late nights at work, missed calls, short, distracted answers when I asked him simple questions. I told myself it was stress, that he was overwhelmed, that becoming a father was just hitting him harder than I expected. So I adjusted. I stopped asking too many questions. I tried to be supportive. I made things easier for him, thinking that was what a good wife was supposed to do. But the more I gave, the more distant he became. Until one day, it didn't feel like we were on the same side anymore. It felt like I was standing alone in something I didn't understand. That morning started like any other. I woke up before him, moving carefully so I wouldn't disturb his sleep. My back ached slightly, and my stomach felt heavier than usual. But I had gotten used to that. I walked into the kitchen, made myself something small to eat, and waited for him to come out like I always did. When he finally did, he didn't look at me. Not right away. He grabbed his phone first, scrolling through something with a faint smile that disappeared the moment he noticed me watching. "Morning," I said softly. "Yeah," he replied. Distracted. No smile. No kiss. No warmth. Just distance. I tried to ignore the way that made me feel. Instead, I told him I had a doctor's appointment later that week, that everything seemed fine, but I wanted him to come with me. He hesitated, just for a second, but I saw it. "I'll see if I can make it," he said. Not of course. Not I wouldn't miss it. Just if. That was the moment something inside me tightened. Not enough to break, but enough to hurt. Later that day, he brought up money. Again. "We need to start being more careful," he said, leaning against the kitchen counter. "Things are going to get more expensive." I nodded. That made sense. We had talked about it before. "I can help manage things," he continued. "Just temporarily. It'll be easier if one person handles everything." I remember hesitating, not because I didn't trust him, but because something about the way he said it felt final. Still, I agreed. Because that's what you do when you believe you're building a life with someone. You trust them. Even when you don't fully understand what they're asking for, the changes didn't happen all at once. At first, it was just small things. I couldn't access one of our accounts. Then another. He reassured me every time. "It's just temporary. Don't worry about it." I've got everything under control. And I believed him. Because I wanted to. Because it was easier than questioning everything. Because I was tired. And pregnant. And trying to hold on to the version of my life that was slowly slipping away from me. By the time I realized something was wrong, it was already too late. And that's how I ended up standing in that bus station. Barefoot. Alone. With nothing left except the truth I hadn't been ready to see. And a life growing inside me that I suddenly had to protect, on my own. Kayla didn't ask anything at first. The car was warm, the heater humming softly. But my hands were still cold as they rested protectively over my stomach. I stared out the window, watching the city lights stretch and blur into long streaks of yellow and white. Like everything was moving too fast for me to catch up. She drove with both hands on the wheel, her posture stiff, her jaw tight. That was how I knew. She already understood more than I had said. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with questions she hadn't asked yet, and answers I wasn't ready to give. I swallowed, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't know where else to go. I finally whispered. Kayla didn't look at me, but I saw the way her fingers tightened slightly against the steering wheel. You don't ever have to ask, she said quietly. Her voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, something controlled, something sharp. It made my chest tighten. I turned my head back toward the window, my reflection faint in the glass. For a moment, I barely recognized myself. And that was when the memory hit me. The moment everything started to change. The moment I told Jonathan I was pregnant. It had been a quiet evening. Nothing dramatic. Nothing unusual. Just soft light in the kitchen. The faint smell of coffee still lingering in the air. And the sound of dishes drying on the rack. I remember standing there with the test still in my hand. My heart racing in a way that felt almost unreal. I had imagined that moment so many times. I thought he would smile. I thought he would pull me into his arms. I thought everything would feel certain. Instead, when I told him, he froze. Not for long. Just a second too long. That's great news? He said. His voice sounded right. The words were right. But something about the way he said them didn't reach me. His smile came a little late. Like he had to remember to do it. And when he hugged me, it felt careful, measured. Like he was already somewhere else. I noticed it. Of course I did. But I pushed it away almost immediately. He was probably just overwhelmed. Anyone would be. That's what I told myself. That's what I needed to believe. The next few days passed quietly. Too quietly. Jonathan started coming home later than usual. At first, it was small, 30 minutes. Maybe an hour. Then it became normal. Then it became expected. He still spoke to me. He still answered when I asked questions. But it felt different. Like I was talking to someone who was only half there. At dinner, he would sit across from me, his phone face down beside his plate. He would nod at the right moments, respond when necessary, but his eyes would drift away, like his attention was always being pulled somewhere else. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was stress, work, pressure. I adjusted the way I spoke to him, choosing lighter topics, trying not to overwhelm him, trying not to add to whatever he was already carrying. But the more I softened, the further he seemed to slip away. It wasn't a fight. That would have been easier. It was silence. A quiet, growing distance that I couldn't name, but could feel in everything he did. A week later, he brought up money. We were standing in the kitchen again, almost the exact same place where I had told him I was pregnant. We need to be more careful now, he said, leaning back against the counter. Things are going to change. I nodded immediately. That made sense. A baby changes everything. I can take over the finances for a while, he continued, just to make things easier. I looked at him, slightly confused. I already handle most of it, I said gently. I know, he replied quickly. But this is different now. It's about stability. Stability. The word sounded reasonable. Responsible. I hesitated. Just for a moment. But then I nodded. Okay, I said. He smiled again. That same careful smile. And I told myself I was imagining things. At first, the changes were small. One account I couldn't access. Then another. Each time I asked, he had an answer ready. It's just temporary. I moved things around. Don't worry about it. And I didn't. Or at least, I tried not to. Because worrying meant questioning him. And questioning him meant admitting something might be wrong. So I chose trust, even when it started to feel like I was the only one holding on to it. A few days later, I met Kayla for coffee. She was already there when I arrived, sitting near the window, her posture relaxed but her eyes alert. She smiled when she saw me, but it didn't take long for that smile to fade slightly. "You look tired," she said. I laughed softly, brushing it off. "I'm pregnant," I replied. "That's part of the job." She didn't laugh. She studied me instead, her gaze sharp in a way that made me shift slightly in my seat. "No," she said quietly. "This is different." I looked down at my cup, tracing the edge of it with my finger. "I'm fine," I said. But even to me, it didn't sound convincing. Kayla leaned back slightly, crossing her arms. "You still have access to everything, right?" she asked casually. The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "Your accounts. Your money." I hesitated. Just for a second. And that was enough. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "But she didn't push. Just asking," she said. I nodded quickly, forcing a small smile. "Everything's fine." But as I said it, something inside me shifted. Because for the first time, I wasn't completely sure it was true. That night, I lay in bed beside Jonathan, staring up at the ceiling. He was turned slightly away from me, his back facing me, his phone lighting up the darkness every few minutes. I pretended to be asleep. I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't ask. I just watched the faint glow reflect against the wall, over and over again. And for the first time, I didn't feel confused. I felt something else, something colder, something quieter, something that didn't need answers to know the truth was already there. I closed my eyes slowly, my hand resting over my stomach, and a thought settled into my mind, steady and undeniable. Something was changing. Not slowly, not accidentally, deliberately. I just didn't know yet that I wasn't being left behind. I was being replaced. I noticed it the next morning. Not in a dramatic way. Not all at once. Just a small, quiet detail that didn't belong. Jonathan's phone was gone. He never took it to the shower. Not once in all the years we'd been together. It was always on the nightstand. Always within reach but never hidden. But that morning, it wasn't there. I stood in the bedroom doorway, listening to the sound of running water from the bathroom. My eyes fixed on the empty space beside the bed. Something inside me tightened. I told myself it didn't mean anything. People change habits. People become more careful, more private. That's normal. Right. I turned away before I could think too much about it. The kitchen felt colder than usual. I poured myself a glass of water, my hands moving automatically, my mind still circling that one detail. Gone. Hidden. Different. I pressed my lips together, trying to shake it off. But the feeling stayed. It stayed all day. Jonathan left early, barely finishing his coffee. He kissed my cheek, quick, distant, and was out the door before I could say much more than goodbye. The silence he left behind felt heavier than usual. By midday, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I opened my laptop. Not with a plan. Not with certainty. Just curiosity. That's what I told myself. I logged into our shared financial dashboard. Or at least, I tried to. Access denied. The words sat there. Simple and absolute. I blinked. Refreshed the page. Tried again. Same result. A slow wave of heat moved through my chest. That didn't make sense. I had always had full access. Always. I reached for my phone. Opening the banking app. The password I'd used for years didn't work. I tried again. Slower this time. Careful. Still nothing. My fingers hovered over the screen. Suddenly unsure. A small voice in my head whispered something I didn't want to hear. This wasn't an accident. I sat back in my chair. My heart beat louder now. Sharper. Okay. Fine. Maybe he changed something. Maybe there was a reason. Maybe... I forced myself to stop. I picked up my phone and called him. It rang twice before going to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I tried again 10 minutes later. Same result. I stared at the screen, my reflection faint in the black glass. For a moment, I felt ridiculous, suspicious, paranoid. But then I remembered Kayla's voice. You still have access to everything, right? I exhaled slowly. No, I didn't. Not anymore. That afternoon, I drove to the bank. I didn't tell Jonathan. I didn't even fully decide to go. My body just moved. The air outside was crisp. The sky too bright. Like the world hadn't gotten the message that something was wrong. Inside the bank, everything felt normal. Too normal. The quiet hum of conversation. The soft tapping of keyboards. The polite smiles. I walked up to the counter, forcing my voice to stay steady. I'd like to check my account access, I said. The woman behind the desk smiled politely. Typing in my information? Of course. Let me just pull that up for you. I waited. Seconds stretched longer than they should have. Her expression changed first. Just slightly. A flicker of something uncertain. Then she looked back at me. Ma'am, it looks like your authorization was removed yesterday. The words landed softly, but they hit like something much heavier. I'm sorry, I asked. She turned the screen slightly, pointing. Your name is no longer listed as an authorized user on this account. I stared at the screen. My name. Gone. Just like that. Who removed it? I asked. Even though I already knew. She hesitated. Your husband is listed as the primary account holder. Of course he was. Of course. A quiet, hollow feeling spread through my chest. I nodded slowly, forcing myself to stay composed. Can it be restored? I asked. She shook her head gently. Not without his authorization. His authorization. The irony of it almost made me laugh. Instead, I thanked her, my voice distant, and walked out of the bank. The sunlight felt harsher now. Too bright. Too sharp. I sat in my car for a long moment, my hands resting on the steering wheel. My thoughts finally starting to line up in a way they hadn't before. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't stress. This wasn't distance. This was control. Carefully planned. Quietly executed. I swallowed hard. My throat suddenly dry. And then something clicked. A memory. A small, almost insignificant moment from a few nights ago. Jonathan standing in the living room. His back to me. Speaking softly on the phone. I hadn't paid attention at the time. I hadn't needed to. But now, I remembered one sentence. Clear. Sharp. We're almost done. I closed my eyes. The pieces were starting to form something I couldn't ignore anymore. This wasn't happening to me. It was being done to me. Deliberately. Systematically. I opened my eyes slowly, staring straight ahead. For the first time since all of this began, I didn't feel lost. I felt something else. Awake. Careful. Alert. I reached for my phone again. This time, I didn't call Jonathan. I called Kayla. She answered on the first ring. Hey, she said, her voice steady. I didn't waste time. He removed me, I said quietly. There was a pause. Not of confusion. Of confirmation. I figured, she replied. I closed my eyes briefly. A mix of fear and relief washing through me. I don't have access to anything. I continued. Accounts. Funds, everything's gone. Kayla didn't speak immediately. I could hear her breathing on the other end. Thinking, calculating. Okay, she said finally. Listen to me carefully, Her tone shifted. No longer casual. No longer curious. Focused. You're not going back there tonight. My grip tightened on the phone. What? You heard me, she said. You come to my place. Now. A part of me wanted to argue, to question, to defend him. But that part felt smaller now. Quieter. What if I'm wrong? I asked, even though I already knew I wasn't. Kayla didn't hesitate. Then nothing happens, she said. But if you're right, we're already late. The words settled into me, heavy and undeniable. I looked down at my hands, at the slight tremble I couldn't quite control, at the life growing inside me. And suddenly, this wasn't just about me anymore. I exhaled slowly. I'm on my way, I said, as I ended the call. One thought echoed louder than the rest. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a setup. And whatever Jonathan was planning, I had just stepped out of it. Kayla didn't ask me to explain everything right away. She opened the door before I even knocked. Like she had been waiting. Like she already knew I would come. The moment I stepped inside, the tension I had been holding all day shifted, but it didn't disappear. It sharpened. Because now it was real. Sit, she said, guiding me toward the couch. Her apartment was quiet, warm, controlled, everything my home hadn't felt like in days. I lowered myself slowly, my hands instinctively resting over my stomach again, as if grounding myself. Kayla disappeared briefly into the kitchen and came back with a glass of water. Drink, she said. I obeyed without thinking. The cool water easing the dryness in my throat, but doing nothing to slow my racing thoughts. She sat across from me, leaning forward, her eyes locked onto mine. Start from the beginning, she said. So I did, not all at once, not perfectly. The words came in fragments, Jonathan's reaction, the distance, the late nights, the finances, the bank, the missing access. Every detail that had once felt small now sounded different when I said it out loud. Sharper, more deliberate. Kayla didn't interrupt. Not once. But I could see it in her face, the way her jaw tightened, the way her eyes darkened with every piece I added. When I finished, the silence between us felt different than before. It wasn't uncertainty anymore. It was clarity. He's isolating you, she said finally. The words landed clean, precise. I swallowed. I thought maybe I was overreacting, I admitted. Kayla shook her head immediately. No, she said. This is structured. Structured. The word made my stomach drop. This isn't just about money, she continued. This is about control, access, positioning. Positioning. I let that sink in, my fingers tightening slightly against the glass I was still holding. Why? I asked quietly. Kayla leaned back slightly, crossing her arms. Because you're about to become vulnerable, she said. Pregnant, dependent, distracted. That's when people like him make their move. A cold chill moved through me. People like him. I had never thought of Jonathan that way. Not once. But now, I couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. Kayla stood up suddenly. Give me your phone, she said. I handed it to her without hesitation. She moved quickly, her fingers flying across the screen, checking settings, emails, apps. What are you looking for? I asked. Anything he might have access to, she replied. Tracking, shared logins, linked accounts. My chest tightened. Would he do that? Kayla glanced up at me, her expression steady. He already removed you from your own finances, she said. Don't underestimate what else he's capable of. I fell silent, because I couldn't argue with that. A few minutes later, she handed my phone back. Nothing obvious, she said. But we're not taking chances. She walked over to her desk, pulling out a laptop. First step, she said. We separate you completely. The word separate echoed in my mind. Final, unavoidable. Kayla? I hesitated. She looked up. What if there's an explanation? I asked, even though the question felt weaker now. Her expression softened just slightly. Then we'll find it, she said. But we're not going to wait around and hope for it. I nodded slowly. Because deep down, I already knew there wasn't one. The next hour moved fast. Too fast. New email account. New passwords. Secure backups. Kayla explained everything as she worked. Her voice calm. Methodical. Like she had done this before. Control the information. You control the outcome, she said. I watched her. A strange mix of gratitude and fear building inside me. How do you know all of this? I asked. She paused for just a second, then continued typing. I've seen it before, she said simply. That was all. But it was enough. By the time she finished, I felt different. Not safe. Not yet. But prepared. And that changed everything. What about the house? I asked quietly. Kayla closed the laptop, her gaze returning to me. You're not going back tonight, she said firmly. I have things there, I replied. Things can be replaced, she said. You can't. Her words settled into me, heavy but undeniable. I looked down at my hands again, at the faint tremor that hadn't fully disappeared, at the life depending on me, and for the first time, I didn't hesitate. Okay? I said. Kayla nodded once, like she had been waiting for that answer. Good, she said. She stood up again, walking toward the window, her posture tense now. Alert. Because if I'm right, she continued. I felt my chest tighten. If you're right about what? I asked. She didn't turn around immediately. When she did, her expression was different, more serious, more focused than I had ever seen it. This isn't just about him leaving you, she said. A quiet, heavy silence followed. My heart started to pound again, slower this time, but stronger. Then what is it? I asked. Kayla held my gaze. This is about him making sure you walk away with nothing. The words hit harder than anything else she had said. Because suddenly, everything made sense. The finances, the distance, the silence. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't stress. It was preparation. Careful. Calculated. Final. I leaned back into the couch, the weight of it pressing down on me. For a moment, I couldn't speak, couldn't think, couldn't even breathe properly. And then, slowly, something inside me shifted. Not fear, not panic. Something else. Something steadier, stronger. I looked up at Kayla, my voice quieter now, but clearer. Then he's not going to get what he wants. Kayla didn't smile, but there was a flicker of approval in her eyes. No, she said. He's not. And for the first time since this all began, I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was getting ready. The first night away from the house should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like waiting. Kayla gave me her bedroom and took the couch without arguing, without making it a conversation. The sheets smelled faintly like lavender, clean and unfamiliar, and I lay there staring at the ceiling long after the lights were off. Sleep didn't come. Every sound felt amplified, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint traffic outside, the quiet shift of the building settling into the night. But none of it was what kept me awake. It was the absence. Jonathan hadn't called. Not once. No messages. No missed calls. Nothing. I turned onto my side, staring at my phone on the nightstand. If I had disappeared, if I had been unreachable for even a few hours before all of this, he would have noticed. He would have called. He would have asked. Now, silence. And that silence said more than anything else could have. I reached for the phone, unlocking it slowly. Still nothing. No concern. No confusion. Just empty space? A slow, steady realization settled into me. He knew I was gone, and he didn't care. Or worse, he expected it. I closed my eyes, my hand resting over my stomach, trying to steady the wave of emotion rising in my chest. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't distance. It wasn't something that could be fixed with a conversation. This was intention, carefully executed. I finally drifted into a shallow sleep sometime before dawn. When I woke up, the light coming through the window felt too bright, too sharp for how little rest I had gotten. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then everything came back. Fast, clear, unavoidable. I sat up slowly, my body heavier than usual, my thoughts already racing ahead. I reached for my phone again. Still nothing. No messages. No calls. No attempt to reach me at all. I exhaled slowly, pushing back the tightness in my chest. Good, I whispered to myself, because now there was no doubt left. No illusion to hold on to. I got dressed quietly and stepped out into the living room. Kayla was already awake, sitting at the table with her laptop open, a cup of coffee beside her. She looked up as I entered, studying my face for a brief moment. "You didn't sleep," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," I admitted. She nodded, like she expected that. "Good," she said. I frowned slightly. That's a strange response. Kayla closed her laptop halfway, leaning back in her chair. "Clarity doesn't come from comfort," she replied. "It comes from seeing things exactly as they are." I didn't respond, because I understood what she meant, even if I didn't like it. "Any calls?" she asked. I shook my head. "Nothing." Kayla's expression didn't change, but I saw the confirmation in her eyes. "Then we move forward," she said simply. Forward. The word felt heavier now, more real. "What does that look like?" I asked. Kayla reached for a folder on the table, sliding it toward me. Inside were documents, blank forms, notes. "Protection first," she said. "Then strategy." I flipped through the pages, my brow furrowing slightly. Legal terms, financial statements, requests. "What is all this?" I asked. "Preparation," she replied. "In case this becomes exactly what it looks like." My chest tightened. "And what does it look like?" I asked quietly. Kayla met my eyes. "A controlled exit," she said. "Where you lose access, lose leverage, and eventually lose everything." The words settled into me with a heavy, undeniable weight. I looked back down at the papers in my hands. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was a scenario, a plan, and I was at the center of it. "What do I need to do?" I asked. Kayla didn't hesitate. "We document everything," she said. "Every account change, every conversation, every detail. We rebuild your position before he realizes you've stepped out of his control." I nodded slowly, the clarity she had spoken about beginning to take shape inside me. "And the house?" I asked. "We go back," she said. I froze. "What?" "Not to stay," she clarified. "To observe?" A wave of unease moved through me. He could be there. Kayla's gaze didn't waver. Exactly. I hesitated. Everything in me wanted to avoid that house, to stay here where things felt contained, manageable, but I knew she was right. If this was a plan, I needed to see it, understand it. "Okay," I said quietly. Kayla nodded once. "We don't go in blind," she added. "We go in aware." An hour later, we were in the car. The drive felt shorter than it should have. Or maybe my thoughts were just moving too fast to measure time properly. As we turned onto my street, my chest tightened. Nothing looked different. The house stood exactly as it always had. Still, ordinary, like nothing inside it had changed. But I knew better now. Kayla parked a short distance away. "We walk?" she said. I nodded, stepping out of the car, the air cooler than I expected. Each step toward the house felt heavier, slower, like I was walking into something I couldn't unsee. We reached the front door. I hesitated, just for a second. Then I unlocked it. The house was quiet, too quiet. I stepped inside slowly, my eyes scanning everything automatically. Nothing out of place, nothing obvious. But something felt off. Kayla moved beside me, her gaze sharper, more focused. "Don't look for what's missing," she said quietly. "Look for what's new." I nodded, forcing myself to adjust, to see differently, to notice, and then I saw it. A small detail. Easy to miss, but impossible to ignore once I noticed it. On the kitchen counter, there were 2 coffee cups. Not 1, 2. Clean. Recently used. My breath caught slightly, because I knew I hadn't been the one to use the second one. I turned slowly toward Kayla. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The message was already clear. I wasn't the only one who had been in this house. And whatever Jonathan was planning, he wasn't doing it alone. I didn't touch the cups at first. I just stood there, staring at them like they might explain themselves if I waited long enough. They were identical, plain white. The kind we'd bought together years ago without thinking much about it. But now they felt different. One was slightly closer to the edge of the counter. The other had a faint lipstick mark along the rim. Not mine. I didn't wear that shade. A slow, controlled breath left my lungs. Behind me, I could feel Kayla watching, not saying anything, giving me space to see it fully, to understand it without interruption. "She was here," I said quietly. It wasn't a question. Kayla stepped closer, her voice low. "Recently," she added. I nodded. Of course. The coffee wasn't cold in that stale, forgotten way. The air still carried a faint trace of something unfamiliar, something floral, light, and completely out of place in a house that had always smelled like neutral detergent and morning coffee. I reached out and touched the edge of the counter, grounding myself. "Okay," I whispered. Kayla tilted her head slightly. "Okay," she repeated. I straightened slowly, my hand falling back to my side. "This helps," I said. Because it did. It removed the last piece of doubt. There was no misunderstanding left. No alternate explanation to cling to. Only clarity. Kayla watched me carefully, measuring my reaction. "You're not surprised," she said. "I am," I replied. "But I'm not confused anymore." And that was the difference. I stepped further into the kitchen, my eyes moving more deliberately now, scanning every surface, every detail. "Look at the placement," Kayla said quietly. 2 cups, side by side, not rushed, not hidden. I followed her line of thinking. "They weren't worried about me coming back," I said. Kayla nodded once. "Exactly." A quiet chill moved through me, because that meant something else. They expected me to be gone. I continued. Kayla didn't answer. She didn't need to. I turned away from the counter, moving toward the living room. Everything looked normal. Too normal. The couch was untouched. The pillows in place. The soft throw blanket folded neatly over the armrest. But now I saw it differently. Not as comfort. As staging. "They're comfortable here," I said. Kayla's voice came from behind me. "They're claiming the space." The words hit deeper than I expected. Claiming. Replacing. I swallowed hard, forcing the emotion down before it could take control. "Upstairs," I said. Kayla didn't hesitate. We moved together, our steps quiet but purposeful. Each stair felt heavier than the last. The hallway greeted us with the same stillness, the same carefully maintained normalcy. I walked straight to the bedroom door. My hand paused on the handle. Just for a moment. Then I pushed it open. The room was clean. Ordered. Exactly how I had left it. But again, something was off. Kayla stepped in beside me, her gaze immediately scanning the details. "Closet," she said. I nodded, already moving toward it. I opened the door slowly. At first, everything looked the same. My clothes, my shoes, my things. Then I noticed the gap. Small, subtle, but undeniable. One section of the hanging space was lighter, less full. I stepped closer, running my fingers along the empty hangers. "He moved things," I said. Kayla crossed her arms. Not yours, she replied. I turned to her. Then whose? Her eyes held mine for a second. Not someone new, she said. Someone already integrated. The implication settled in quickly. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't impulsive. This had been building. Planned. I closed my eyes briefly, letting that truth settle fully before I opened them again. Check the drawers, Kayla said. I pulled open the top drawer of the dresser. Nothing unusual. The second. The third. Then, I froze. There, tucked neatly among Jonathan's things, was something that didn't belong. A small, delicate piece of jewelry. Not mine. Not anything I had ever seen before. I picked it up slowly, the metal cool against my fingers. Subtle, Kayla said quietly behind me. I turned it over in my hand. She's not hiding, I said. No, Kayla agreed. She's settling in. A sharp, controlled breath filled my lungs. This wasn't just betrayal. It was replacement. Systematic. Confident. I set the jewelry back exactly where I found it, not touching anything else, not disturbing the scene. What now? I asked. Kayla stepped closer, her voice steady. Now we confirm the timeline. I frowned slightly. How? She gestured toward the nightstand. Check his side. I moved over, opening the drawer. Inside. Everything looked ordinary until I saw the envelope. Plain. Unmarked. I pulled it out. My fingers suddenly colder. Open it, Kayla said. I hesitated. Then I did. Inside were documents. Printed, organized, legal. My eyes moved quickly over the text. And then stopped. My name. My signature. But I hadn't signed this. A wave of cold moved through me. What is it? Kayla asked. I swallowed hard. Separation paperwork, I said. Her expression sharpened. Filed. I scanned the page again. No, I replied slowly. Prepared. Prepared. Ready? Waiting. My grip tightened on the papers. He was going to do this, I said. Kayla nodded once. On his terms. I looked up at her. The weight of everything pressing down, but not breaking me. Not anymore. Because now I could see it. The structure, the intention, the plan, and more importantly, the weakness. I slid the documents back into the envelope, placing it exactly where it had been. Then I straightened. My voice quieter now, but steadier than it had been since this all began. He thinks I'm already out. Kayla's eyes narrowed slightly. And that gives us time, she said. I nodded. Time. Not to run. Not to hide. But to prepare. To reposition. To take back control. I glanced around the room one last time. At the life that had quietly shifted without me noticing. At the space that was no longer mine. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was losing it. I felt like I was stepping outside of it. And that changed everything. Let's go, I said. Because whatever came next, I was no longer walking into it blindly. I was walking in ready. I didn't speak until we were back in the car. The door closed, sealing us off from the house. From the version of my life that had just quietly collapsed behind me. For a moment, I just sat there, my hands resting in my lap, my eyes fixed straight ahead. Kayla didn't start the engine. She waited. She always did that, gave space when it mattered most. He forged it, I said finally. My voice sounded calmer than I expected, almost detached. Kayla turned slightly toward me. You're sure? She asked. I nodded once. I know my signature, I said. That wasn't it. The words settled between us, heavy but clear. Kayla exhaled slowly, leaning back in her seat. Okay, she said. Then this just escalated. I let that sink in, because this wasn't just manipulation anymore. This was fraud. Intentional. Documented. Actionable. I closed my eyes briefly, pressing my fingertips together. He was going to file it. I continued. When everything else was already in place. Kayla nodded. Assets secured. Access removed. Narrative controlled. Her words aligned perfectly with everything I had just seen. And me? I asked quietly. She didn't hesitate. Isolated, she said. Unprepared. Dependent. A cold clarity moved through me. That was the role he had assigned me. That was the position he had built. And I had almost stepped into it without realizing. I opened my eyes. The fog that had followed me for days finally gone. So we don't let him? I said. Kayla's lips curved slightly, not a smile. But something close. No, she agreed. We don't. She reached into the back seat, pulling forward a small bag I hadn't noticed before. Inside were documents. Folders. A tablet. Prepared. Of course she was. What is this? I asked. Your counterposition, she said. I felt a shift in my chest. Not fear. Not uncertainty. Something sharper. Focus. Kayla handed me a folder. Open it, she said. I did. Inside were copies of financial records, older ones. Ones I still had access to before everything was cut off. Statements. Transfers. Account histories. How did you get these? I asked. You sent me backups a while ago, she said. You just didn't realize why you were doing it. A faint memory surfaced, me forwarding files casually, thinking nothing of it. At the time, it had felt routine. Now it felt like instinct. Good, I said quietly. Kayla leaned forward slightly, her tone shifting. We don't react emotionally anymore, she said. We move strategically. I nodded, because that was the only way forward now. What's the first move? I asked. Her answer came without hesitation. We secure your legal ground before he makes his. I felt my pulse steady. How? Kayla reached for the tablet, tapping the screen a few times before turning it toward me. Emergency consultation, she said. Family law. Financial fraud. Documentation ready. I stared at the screen. Everything was already lined up. Appointments. Names. Contacts. You planned this fast? I said. Kayla's gaze met mine. I didn't plan it, she said. I recognized it. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't new to her. This pattern, this strategy, she had seen it before. And she knew how it ended. Unless we changed it. When? I asked. Today, she replied. A quiet determination settled into me. No more waiting. No more hesitation. Okay, I said. Kayla started the car. As we pulled away from the curb, I glanced back once. At the house. At the place that had once felt like certainty. Now it just looked still. Empty. Like a stage after the performance was over. I turned forward again. And didn't look back. The drive to the office was quiet. But not heavy. Not like before. This silence was different. It was focused. Intentional. Kayla parked in front of a modest building, nothing flashy. Nothing attention-grabbing. Good lawyers don't advertise loudly, she said as we stepped out. I nodded, following her inside. The air smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. Clean. Orderly. Controlled. A receptionist greeted us. Her tone professional. Her movements efficient. Kayla, she said with a small nod. So she had been here before. Of course she had. We're ready, Kayla replied. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. We were led into a private office. The man inside stood as we entered, extending his hand. His expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp. Observant. Evaluating. Have a seat, he said. I sat. Kayla remained beside me. Steady. Present. We'll keep this direct, he continued. Tell me exactly what's happened. So I did. Again. But this time, it felt different. Clearer. More structured. I wasn't explaining. I was presenting the distance, the financial removal, the forged documents, every detail. laid out in sequence. When I finished, the room was quiet. The lawyer leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled together. "All right," he said. One word. But it carried weight. "This is recoverable," he continued. A breath I didn't realize I was holding released slowly. "But only if we move first." Kayla glanced at me. "That was our window, our advantage." "What do we do?" I asked. He didn't hesitate. "We file before he does," he said. "We secure your position, challenge the documentation, and freeze any further movement." Freeze. The word echoed in my mind. Everything Jonathan had been building could be stopped. I felt something shift again. Not just control, power. "What about the accounts?" I asked. "They can be traced," he said. "And if necessary, contested." I nodded slowly. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of something else. Something I hadn't been prepared for before. But now, The meeting ended with documents in my hand. Real ones. Valid ones. Signed. Filed. As we stepped back outside, the air felt different. Lighter. Not because things were over, but because they had finally begun on my terms. Kayla looked at me, her expression steady. "You're not behind anymore," she said. I held her gaze. "No," I replied. And for the first time since everything started, I knew exactly where I stood. Not as the person being pushed out, not as the one being replaced, but as the one who had just stepped back in and changed the game completely. Jonathan called that evening. Not during the day. Not when I was at the bank. Not when I left the house. Not when I stopped answering. Only after everything had already shifted. I stared at his name on the screen as it lit up, my phone vibrating softly in my hand. For a moment, I didn't move. Kayla glanced at me from across the room, her expression unreadable but focused. "Answer," she said. I nodded once and accepted the call. "Hey!" Jonathan's voice came through. Smooth. Controlled. Like nothing had happened. "Where are you?" No concern. No urgency. Just a question. I leaned back slightly, keeping my tone even. "I needed some space," I said. There was a pause. Short. Calculated. "Space," he repeated lightly. "You just disappeared." I almost smiled. Because that wasn't true. I hadn't disappeared. I had stepped out. Deliberately. "You didn't try to find me," I replied. Another pause. "This one slightly longer." "I assumed you were with Kayla," he said. Of course he did. Which meant he had expected it. "Why would you assume that?" I asked. A faint shift in his tone. Subtle. Barely there. But I caught it. "You've been distant," he said. "I figured you needed someone to talk to." Distant. The word felt almost ironic. "I see," I said quietly. Kayla's eyes stayed on me. Sharp. Tracking every word. Jonathan exhaled on the other end. "Look," he continued, his voice softening just enough to sound reasonable. "We don't have to do this like this." Like this? Carefully vague. Carefully controlled. "How do you want to do it?" I asked. Another pause. I could almost hear him choosing his next words. "Together," he said. Calmly. Rationally. Rationally. I let the words sit there for a moment. Then I spoke. "Then why did you remove me from the accounts?" Silence. Real silence this time. Not calculated. Not controlled. Just still. "I didn't remove you," he said finally. The lie was smooth. Practiced. But now I could hear it clearly. "Yes, you did," I replied. "I went to the bank today." Another shift. This time sharper. "You went to the bank?" he asked. There it was. Not concern. Not confusion. Surprise. Because I wasn't supposed to do that. "I did," I said calmly. Kayla's gaze flickered slightly. A quiet signal of approval. Jonathan cleared his throat. "I was going to explain that," he said. "It's temporary." Just restructuring. Restructuring. A familiar word. One he had already used before. And the paperwork? I asked. This time, the silence stretched longer. What paperwork? He asked carefully. I didn't answer right away. I let the moment breathe. Let the pressure build. The separation documents, I said finally. The ones with my name on them. Another silence. He didn't speak. Didn't interrupt. Didn't deny it immediately. And that hesitation told me everything. You went through my things, he said at last. The shift was subtle, but it was there. From defense to accusation, I almost admired it. Almost. I went through my house. I corrected. His exhale came sharper this time. You weren't supposed to see that yet, he said. There it was. Not denial. Not explanation. Confirmation. Kayla's posture straightened slightly across from me. I felt something inside me settle completely. So it's real. I said, yes, he replied, his tone now more direct. Less careful. But it's not what you think. I almost laughed. Because that line always came next. Then explain it, I said. He hesitated again. Not because he didn't have an answer. Because he needed the right one. It's just preparation, he said. In case things don't work out. Preparation. The same word. The same strategy. Only now. It sounded different. Empty. You forged my signature, I said quietly. Silence. Longer this time. He didn't answer immediately. Didn't try to smooth it over. Because there wasn't a way to... I was going to talk to you about that, he said finally. I closed my eyes briefly. Not out of frustration. Out of clarity. You were going to file it, I replied. No, he said quickly. I wasn't... Yes. You were... I interrupted. My voice didn't rise. Didn't shake. It stayed steady. And that seemed to throw him off more than anything else. You don't understand how complicated this is, he said. Complicated. Another deflection. I understand enough, I replied. A pause. Then his tone changed again. Lower. Colder. If you push this, he said, it's not going to end the way you think. There it was. The first real glimpse of it. Not control. Not manipulation. Threat. Subtle, but unmistakable. Kayla's eyes narrowed slightly. I leaned back in my chair. My grip on the phone steady. I already did, I said. Silence. What do you mean? He asked. I let a small pause settle before answering. I've already filed, I said. The reaction was immediate. What? For the first time since the call began. He lost control. Just for a second. But it was enough. You filed, he repeated. Yes, I said calmly. Today. Another silence. But this one was different. Not calculated. Not controlled. Disrupted. You shouldn't have done that, he said. The words came out sharper now. More direct. I should have done it sooner, I replied. Kayla's expression didn't change. But I could feel the shift in the room. Jonathan exhaled slowly. You're making a mistake, he said. No, I replied quietly. I'm correcting one. The line went quiet again. But this time, I didn't wait. I know about the accounts. I continued. I know about the documents. And I know I wasn't supposed to see any of it yet. No response. Just breathing on the other end. Heavy now. Less controlled. This doesn't go the way you planned anymore, I said. And I meant it. Fully. Completely. When he finally spoke again, his voice was different. Not smooth. Not careful. Something underneath it had surfaced. You think you've won? He asked. I didn't answer right away. Because this wasn't about winning. Not yet. This isn't over, he added. No. I agreed. It's not. And then I ended the call. The silence that followed felt different. Not heavy. Not uncertain. Clear. Kayla leaned forward slightly. Well? She asked. I set the phone down slowly. He didn't expect me to move first, I said. Kayla nodded once. And now? She asked. I looked up at her. The last traces of doubt completely gone. Now he knows, I replied, that I wasn't the one being removed. I was the one rewriting the outcome. The message came the next morning. Not from Jonathan. From a number I didn't recognize. I stared at the screen as the notification appeared. A single line of text sitting there like it had been placed carefully, intentionally. We need to talk. No name. No context. But I already knew. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit there, letting the silence around it stretch, letting the weight of it settle before I reacted. Kayla noticed. Unknown number, she asked, her voice calm but attentive. I nodded slightly. Yeah. She didn't ask who. She didn't need to read it, she said. I tapped the screen. The message expanded, unchanged. Just those 4 words. Simple. Direct. Controlled. I exhaled slowly. She reached out, I said. Kayla leaned back slightly, crossing her arms. Of course she did. There was no surprise in her voice, only confirmation. She wants control of the narrative, Kayla continued, face to face. She thinks she can manage it. I glanced at her. Should I respond? Kayla didn't answer immediately. She thought. Calculated. Not emotionally, she said finally. Only strategically. I nodded. Because that was the only way now. My fingers hovered over the screen before I typed. Where? I didn't add anything else. No emotion. No hesitation. Just a question. The response came almost instantly. A location. A cafe downtown. Public. Visible. Controlled. She picked somewhere open, I said. Kayla nodded. That's not for safety, she said. That's for optics. Optics. Of course. Everything about this was controlled. Structured. I'll go, I said. Kayla's eyes sharpened. Not alone. I hesitated. She asked to talk, I replied. And she will, Kayla said. But not on her terms. The distinction mattered. I could feel that now. What do we do? I asked. Kayla stood up. Already moving. We prepare. The word felt familiar now. Not threatening. Not overwhelming. Necessary. An hour later, we were sitting in the cafe. I arrived first. Not because I wanted to. Because Kayla insisted. Position matters, she had said. So I sat where I could see the entrance. Where the light hit just right. Where nothing was behind me. Control. I was starting to understand it. Kayla sat at a table slightly behind and to the side. Not hidden. But not obvious. Present. Aware. Watching. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup in front of me. Though I hadn't taken a sip, my heartbeat was steady. Not racing. Not panicked. Just ready? The door opened, and she walked in. I knew immediately. Not because I had seen her before, but because of the way she carried herself. Confident. Measured. Like she already belonged. Her eyes scanned the room once before landing on me. A small smile touched her lips as she approached. Polite. Controlled. Hi, she said as she reached the table. Her voice was soft. Carefully neutral. Hi, I replied. She sat down across from me without waiting. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just like she had sat at my kitchen counter. Like she had stood in my house. I'm glad you came, she said. I didn't respond. I let the silence sit between us. Let her feel it. Her smile shifted slightly. Not fading. Adjusting. I think we both know this situation has become complicated, she continued. Complicated. Another familiar word. Used to soften something that wasn't soft at all. I don't think it's complicated, I said. Her eyes flickered slightly. Just for a second. Then steadied again. No, she asked. No, I replied. I think it's very clear. A pause. Then she leaned back slightly, studying me. "Then you know why I'm here," she said. I held her gaze. "Say it," I replied. Another pause, longer this time, because this part mattered. "I'm here to make this easier for you," she said. The words landed softly, almost gently, but the meaning behind them was anything but. I tilted my head slightly. "Easier," I repeated. She nodded. "Yes," she said. "This doesn't have to turn into something messy." Messy. The word carried weight. Legal weight. Financial weight. Reputational weight. "You mean for you," I said. Her smile tightened. "Just slightly." "For everyone," she corrected. I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence stretch again. Let her fill it if she wanted to. She didn't. She waited. "Careful. Strategic. You've already taken steps," she said finally. "Filed. Contacted people. Moved things forward." So she knew. Of course she did. Jonathan had told her. Which meant something else. They were aligned. Fully. "Yes," I said. Her fingers tapped lightly against the table. A small, controlled movement. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I did," I replied. Another pause. Then she leaned forward slightly. "We can resolve this quietly," she said, "without dragging everything out." There it was. The offer. The positioning. "What does resolve mean?" I asked. Her eyes held mine. "It means you walk away clean," she said. "No complications. No stress. Walk away. Clean. No complications." The phrasing was precise. Carefully chosen. "And what do you get?" I asked. She didn't hesitate. "Stability," she said. I almost smiled, because that was the same word Jonathan had used. Stability. A shared script. A shared plan. I leaned back slightly, my voice calm. "You've been in my house," I said. She didn't flinch. "Yes," she replied. Direct. No denial. No hesitation. "And you're sitting here telling me this is about making things easier for me." I continued. Her expression didn't change. Because she believed it. Or at least, she believed I might. "This is about moving forward," she said. Forward. Another word that sounded good, but meant something else entirely. I nodded slowly. "I agree," I said. Her posture relaxed just slightly. A fraction. But I saw it. That small moment where she thought she had control again. "Good," she said. And that was when I ended it. "But not the way you planned." Her expression stilled. Just for a second. Then shifted. "What does that mean?" she asked. I held her gaze. My voice steady. "It means I'm not walking away," I said. Silence. Heavy now. Different. Because the balance had changed. "You should think carefully about this," she said. Not a suggestion. A warning. I didn't look away. "I already have," I replied. Another pause. Longer. Then she stood. Slowly. Controlled. "This isn't over," she said. The same words. Different voice. Same message. "No," I agreed. "It's not." She studied me for a moment longer, then turned and walked away. I didn't watch her leave. I didn't need to. I already knew what she was. And more importantly, what she wasn't. In control. Kayla approached a moment later, taking the seat across from me. "Well," she asked. I picked up my cup for the first time, taking a slow sip. "She came to negotiate," I said. Kayla nodded. "And?" she asked. I set the cup down carefully. I declined. Kayla's lips curved slightly. Not a smile. Something sharper. "Good," she said. I leaned back, my mind clearer than it had ever been. Because now, there was no confusion left. No uncertainty. No doubt. Only direction. They had made their move. Now, it was my turn. The next move came faster than I expected. Not a call. Not a message. A notice. Delivered formally. Precisely. Exactly the way it had been planned from the beginning. I stared at the envelope in my hands. The official seal sharp against the clean white paper. My name printed clearly across the front. Jonathan had filed. Of course he had. The moment control slipped. He accelerated. Kayla stood beside me as I opened it. Her presence steady. Grounding. Expected? She said quietly. I nodded, sliding the documents out. My eyes moving quickly across the text. Petition for separation. Filed. Stamped. Processed. The timeline was aggressive. Deliberate. Every detail aligned with what we had already uncovered. But something else caught my attention. A line. Small. Easy to miss. But critical. Primary financial authority retained by petitioner. I felt my grip tighten slightly on the page. He's trying to lock it in, I said. Kayla leaned in, scanning the document. Not trying, she corrected. He already did. A cold clarity settled into me. This wasn't reactive. This was phase 2. I exhaled slowly, forcing my focus to sharpen. What's the window? I asked. Kayla didn't hesitate. Short, she said. Very short. Of course it was. That was the point. Pressure. Speed. Limited time to respond. To adjust. To fight. I flipped through the rest of the pages, my mind moving faster now, piecing everything together. Statements. Claims. Narrative. Controlled. Framed. He had positioned himself carefully. Responsible. Stable. Prepared. And me, absent. Uninvolved. Unaware. A version of the story that worked perfectly, if I didn't respond. But I looked up at Kayla. He's building a case, I said. She nodded. And you're about to dismantle it. The words settled into me like something solid. Something I could stand on. What's first? I asked. Kayla reached for her phone. Already dialing. We respond immediately, she said. No delay. No hesitation. The call connected quickly. Yeah, she said into the phone. It's filed. We need to move. A pause. Then a short nod. Good. We're on our way. She ended the call and looked at me. Let's go. The drive felt different this time. Not tense. Not uncertain. Focused. Everything had a direction now. A purpose. When we arrived, the same office greeted us, but it felt different. Not unfamiliar. Strategic. We weren't walking in for advice anymore. We were walking in to act. The lawyer didn't waste time. He already had a copy of the filing in front of him. Fast, he said. Deliberate, Kayla replied. He nodded once, flipping through the pages. They're pushing for control before you can stabilize, he said. I sat down across from him, my posture steady. They won't get it, I replied. He glanced up at me, assessing, then nodded slightly. Good, he said, because this is where it shifts. Shift. The word echoed in my mind. I leaned forward slightly. What do we file? I asked. He slid a document toward me. Response and counter, he said. Challenge the financial authority. Contest the documentation. And initiate an asset review. Asset review. That meant exposure. Tracing. Revealing. Exactly what Jonathan didn't want. This stops him, I asked. It slows him, he replied. And that's enough. Enough. I picked up the pen. For a brief moment, I looked at the paper in front of me. My name. Clear. Real. Not forged. Not manipulated. Mine. Then I signed. The movement felt small. Simple. But it carried weight. More than anything else so far. Because this wasn't reaction anymore. It was action. When I finished, I handed the document back. The lawyer nodded once. I'll file this immediately, he said. Kayla leaned back slightly, watching me. You're ahead now, she said quietly. I shook my head. Not ahead, I replied. Aligned. Because this wasn't about getting in front. It was about being exactly where I needed to be. The lawyer stood, gathering the documents. One more thing, he said. I looked up. If they push harder, and they will, you need to be ready for escalation. Escalation. I felt a small shift in my chest. Not fear, recognition. What does that look like? I asked. His gaze held mine. Pressure, he said. Financial, legal, personal. Personal? That was the part that mattered most. I nodded slowly. I understand. He studied me for a moment longer, then gave a short nod. Good, he said. We stepped back outside shortly after. The air cooler now. Sharper. Kayla glanced at me. You feel it? She asked. I did. The change. The shift. Yes, I said. She nodded. Then we keep moving. I looked ahead. My thoughts no longer scattered. No longer uncertain. Clear. Focused. Ready? Because now I understood something I hadn't before. Jonathan's plan hadn't failed. Not completely. It had almost worked. And that was exactly why it was dangerous. But now, it was exposed. Interrupted. And most importantly, it was no longer his alone. I took a slow breath, steady and controlled. This wasn't about catching up anymore. This wasn't about reacting. This was about control. And for the first time since everything began, I wasn't trying to take it back. I already had... The pressure started quietly. Not with a confrontation. Not with a threat. With absence. By the third day after the filing, 2 of my old accounts, ones I hadn't even thought about yet, were suddenly inactive. Not closed. Not gone. Just inaccessible? I stared at the screen. The error message simple. Neutral. Almost polite. Service temporarily unavailable. Kayla didn't even look surprised. He's testing boundaries, she said from across the room. I exhaled slowly, setting the phone down. He's escalating, I replied. Kayla nodded. Exactly. The pattern was clear now. Jonathan wasn't reacting emotionally. He was adjusting, repositioning, every move calculated, every action designed to apply pressure without crossing a line that could be easily challenged. It was precise, controlled, and dangerous. I leaned back slightly, my hand resting over my stomach, grounding myself as the reality settled deeper. He thinks this will push me into a mistake, I said. Kayla's eyes met mine. He's hoping you'll react, she replied. Emotionally, impulsively. I nodded. Because that had been the plan from the beginning. Keep me off balance, uncertain, dependent. But that version of me was already gone. What's next? I asked. Kayla closed her laptop slowly. We reinforce, she said. The word felt solid, steady. How? I asked. She stood, already moving toward the table where our documents were spread out. We widen the scope, she said. More records, more documentation. We make it harder for him to control the narrative. Narrative? That word again. Everything came back to that. Who controlled the story? Who defined the truth? I nodded, standing as well. Then we don't let him shape it, I said. Kayla's lips curved slightly. Exactly. The next few hours passed in focused silence. Calls, emails, requests. Each step building something stronger, something more structured than what Jonathan had prepared. This wasn't just defense anymore. It was exposure. And that shifted everything. By late afternoon, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't an unknown number. It was Jonathan. I stared at the screen, my expression unchanged. Kayla looked up briefly. You know what to do, she said. I nodded and answered. Hello? I said. His voice came through immediately. Sharp. Controlled, but thinner than before. You've been busy, he said. I almost smiled. Yes, I replied. A pause. Then, "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said. Complicated. Again. Always the same framing. I leaned back slightly, my tone steady. "I don't think I am," I said. Another pause. Longer. More strained. "You filed against me," he continued. I responded. I corrected. Silence. A breath. Then, "You don't understand what you're doing," he said. I didn't react. Because I did understand better than he expected. "I understand enough," I replied. His exhale came sharper this time. "You're opening things that don't need to be opened," he said. There it was. The shift. From control to concern? Not for me. For himself. "That depends on what's inside them," I said. A long silence followed. He didn't answer immediately. Didn't deflect. Didn't redirect. Because he knew the asset review, the documentation, the exposure, all of it was moving towards something he hadn't planned for. "You should have taken the offer," he said finally. Offer. The cafe. The controlled exit. I shook my head slightly, even though he couldn't see it. "That wasn't an offer," I said. "That was an exit." Another pause. Then his tone changed. Lower. More direct. "You think this ends well for you?" he asked. There it was again. The subtle threat, wrapped in doubt, designed to destabilize. But it didn't land the same way anymore. "Better than it would have," I replied. Silence. Heavy now. Different. Because this time, he didn't have control of it. "You're not in the position you think you are," he said. I let the words sit there, then answered calmly. "No," I said. "I'm exactly where I need to be." That stopped him. Just for a second. But I felt it. The break in rhythm. The shift. "You're underestimating what this will cost you," he said. Cost. Another pressure point. Financial. Emotional. Personal. I exhaled slowly. "I already know the cost," I said. And I did, because I had already paid part of it. In trust. In time. In everything I thought this was. The rest was just numbers. Another pause. Then, "You're not thinking clearly," he said. I almost smiled this time, because that was the last line. The final attempt to reframe. To destabilize. To make me question myself. But that version of me was gone. I replied quietly. And that's the problem. Silence. Long. Unbroken. Then the line clicked. He ended the call. I lowered the phone slowly, placing it on the table. Kayla watched me, her expression focused. "Well?" she asked. I looked up at her, my voice steady. "He's feeling it," I said. Kayla nodded once. "Good," she replied. I leaned back slightly, my thoughts clear. Aligned, because now I could see it fully. The pattern, the strategy, the limits. Jonathan wasn't invincible. He was structured. And structure could be broken, not by force, but by precision. I rested my hand lightly over my stomach, the steady rhythm of my breathing grounding me. This wasn't just about stopping him anymore. It was about finishing this, on terms he didn't control, on an outcome he didn't design. Kayla closed the folder in front of her. "We're close," she said. I nodded slowly. "Yes," I replied. And for the first time, I could feel it. Not just the shift, the end. The final notice didn't arrive with tension. It arrived with silence. No urgency, no pressure, just a clean, official confirmation that everything had moved exactly where it needed to go. I sat across from the lawyer again. The same office, the same desk, but nothing felt the same anymore. Because this time, I wasn't waiting for an outcome. I was receiving it. "It's done," he said, sliding the final document toward me. My eyes moved across the page slowly. Asset review completed. Financial authority contested. Documentation invalidated. And the line that mattered most, fraudulent submission identified and dismissed. I exhaled quietly. Not sharply. Not with relief. Just steady. Jonathan's structure had been exposed. Every layer he built, every quiet move, every calculated step had been pulled apart, piece by piece. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Precisely. His position. I asked. The lawyer leaned back slightly. Compromised, he said. He'll have to respond under scrutiny now. Scrutiny. A word that carried weight. Consequences. I nodded once. That was enough. Kayla sat beside me. Her posture relaxed for the first time since this began. You held your ground, she said quietly. I glanced at her. No, I replied. I changed it. Because that was the truth. I hadn't just resisted what he planned. I had stepped outside of it entirely. And that made all the difference. We left the office together. The air outside feeling different again. Not lighter. Not heavier. Clear. Like something had settled into place. For the first time in weeks, my thoughts weren't racing ahead. They weren't trying to solve anything. They were still, and in that stillness, I could finally see everything clearly. The house, the documents, the calls, the manipulation. None of it had been random. None of it had been emotional. It had been structured, designed. And that was exactly why it could be dismantled. Kayla stopped beside me on the sidewalk. So, she said, glancing at me. What now? I looked ahead. Not at anything specific. Just forward. Now I rebuild, I said. Not from loss. Not from damage. From clarity? Kayla nodded once. Good, she said. She didn't add anything else. She didn't need to, because this part wasn't about strategy anymore. It was about direction. I drove alone that evening. Not back to the house. Not back to anything that had been part of that structure. Just forward. The road stretched ahead. Quiet and open. The city lights beginning to glow as the sun dropped lower. For the first time in a long time. I wasn't thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what I had avoided. The version of my life that almost happened. The position I almost stepped into. The outcome that had been waiting for me if I hadn't seen it in time. And that realization stayed with me. Stronger than anything else. Because this wasn't just about betrayal. It wasn't just about control. It was about awareness. The moment you stop reacting and start seeing, I rested one hand lightly over my stomach. A quiet reminder of what mattered most. Not the house. Not the accounts. Not the documents. But what came next. What I chose. What I built. And who I became after all of it. Because in the end, this wasn't his story. It never was. It was mine. And I had just taken it back. If you've ever felt like something didn't add up, like the silence said more than the words ever could, trust that instinct. Sometimes the truth isn't loud. It's quiet, structured, waiting for you to notice. And when you do, everything changes. If this story made you think, or reminded you of something you couldn't quite explain before, stay with me. There's more stories like this, real, layered, and closer to reality than most people expect. Subscribe. And tell me in the comments, at what moment did you realize something wasn't right? Because sometimes, that moment is everything. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.